In the heart of Philadelphia, where modern streets hum with the rhythm of city life, there rises a structure that seems pulled from another world. Its walls are massive, gray, and foreboding, more fortress than prison, and for good reason. For nearly 150 years, this place was a monument to confinement, suffering, and silence. Now it is abandoned, its cell blocks crumbling, its corridors empty, or so it seems. For those who have stepped inside Eastern State Penitentiary, the silence is never complete. Whispers carry where no mouths move, shadows slip where no figure stands, and the cold touch of despair lingers in the air. This is no ordinary ruin. It is one of the most haunted prisons in the world. The story of Eastern State Penitentiary begins not in stone, but in philosophy. In the early 19th century, America was wrestling with how to deal with crime and punishment. Jails at the time were filthy, chaotic places. Men, women, and children often crammed together regardless of their offenses. Violence, disease, and corruption were rampant. Reformers sought something new, something more orderly, and in their eyes, more humane. From these ideals emerged the Pennsylvania system, a radical experiment in solitary confinement. The idea was simple, at least in theory. Criminals would be isolated in individual cells, cut off from one another, given only a Bible and their thoughts. Alone, in silence, they would have time to repent, to reflect on their crimes, and ultimately to reform. It was a system rooted in belief, but it was also rooted in control. And to bring it to life, a prison unlike any ever seen before would be built. In 1829, Eastern State Penitentiary opened its gates. Its design was revolutionary. A massive central hub stood at its core, from which 7 long corridors radiated outward like the spokes of a wheel. Guards could stand at the center and see down each cell block, watching over hundreds of inmates at once. The walls were towering, 30 feet high and 12 feet thick at their base, giving the entire structure the appearance of a medieval castle. Barred gates, heavy wooden doors, and narrow slits for windows reinforced the sense of total isolation. Each prisoner was led to his cell hooded, so he could never learn the layout of the prison. Once inside, the door closed, and he was utterly alone. The cells were stark, with stone walls, a single small skylight, and a wooden door backed by a heavy iron one. Meals were delivered through slots. Exercise was permitted, but only in small, private yards attached to each cell where no one could see or speak to any human being. Silence was enforced with ruthless discipline. To the reformers of the time, this system was a marvel. Charles Dickens, visiting America in 1842, traveled to Eastern State to witness it firsthand, but his reaction was not admiration. What he saw disturbed him deeply. He wrote that the system was cruel and wrong, calling it worse than any torture of the body. For in that silence, in that endless solitude, he saw madness breeding. And indeed, madness did come. Over the decades, countless inmates at Eastern State lost themselves within its walls. Deprived of human contact, their minds began to fracture. Some screamed through the nights, their voices echoing down the stone corridors. Others sank into silence so deep they barely moved, staring blankly into nothing. Stories spread of prisoners whispering to shadows, speaking to ghosts of their own creation. The very system that promised rehabilitation instead carved despair into the souls it confined. Eastern State housed some of the most notorious criminals of its time. Bank robber Slick Willie Sutton spent years behind its walls. The infamous gangster Al Capone was imprisoned there in 1929. While most inmates lived in harsh austerity, Capone's cell became infamous for its relative luxury: a carpet, a radio, even fine furniture. But even Capone, with all his influence, could not escape the weight of the prison's silence. He reportedly claimed to be haunted by a ghost, the spirit of James Clark, one of the men murdered in the St. Valentine's Day massacre. Guards said they heard Capone crying out at night, pleading with an unseen presence to leave him alone. By the early 20th century, the solitary system had begun to erode. Overcrowding forced changes. Cells designed for one inmate often held 2 or 3. Silence was no longer absolute, though it was still enforced harshly. The prison grew, its cell blocks extending further, its walls looming higher, but with growth came decay. Conditions worsened, and Eastern State became notorious not for reform, but for suffering. Whispers of haunting had already begun by then. Guards and prisoners alike told of footsteps echoing in empty corridors, of figures seen standing in cell doorways only to vanish when approached. Cold drafts swept through sealed rooms. The prison, with its Gothic architecture and endless shadows, seemed to breathe despair. Even those who scoffed at superstition admitted that the atmosphere was oppressive, as if the very walls had absorbed the anguish of generations. In 1971, after 149 years of operation, Eastern State Penitentiary finally closed. Its gates were locked, its corridors left to crumble. For a time, nature began to reclaim it. Ivy crawled over stone walls, paint peeled, and roofs collapsed. But abandonment did not bring peace. Instead, the hauntings grew louder. Urban explorers who slipped through its ruins in the years after its closure spoke of voices whispering their names, of shadows that moved against the light, of cold hands brushing against their arms in the dark. When the prison reopened in the 1990s as a historic site, staff and visitors alike added their voices to the tales of the supernatural. In Cell Block 12, once notorious for its solitary cells, echoes of laughter and cries have been reported. Visitors describe hearing footsteps above them when the block is empty, or doors clanging shut on their own. In Cell Block 6, shadowy figures have been seen darting across corridors. In Cell Block 4, people claim to have seen faces appear in the towers, pale and fleeting, watching from above. Perhaps the most chilling reports come from the guard tower, where some say they felt an overwhelming sense of being watched, as though unseen eyes track their every move. Others speak of sudden icy chills, even in the heat of summer, their breath visible in the air, as though the dead themselves exhaled upon them. One story tells of a maintenance worker who was alone in the prison when he encountered something he could not explain. While working on a lock, he suddenly felt a presence behind him. Turning, he saw a shadowy figure dart away. As he pursued, doors clanged shut one after another in front of him, though no one was there. Finally, he felt hands grip him tightly before vanishing into the air. Terrified, he fled and refused to return to that block again. Paranormal investigators have spent countless nights within Eastern State, capturing strange voices on recorders, sudden drops in temperature, and unexplainable movements on camera. Some recordings carry whispers that seem to say, "Get out," or call the names of those present. Others pick up cries, laughter, or moans that cannot be traced to any living source. The deeper they explore, the stronger the sense that the prison's history is alive, replaying itself in fragments of sound and shadow. Skeptics argue that the stories are just products of imagination, fueled by the eerie setting. After all, Eastern State is the perfect stage for ghost stories: Gothic towers, crumbling stone, endless rows of cells. The human mind, they say, fills the silence with fear. But those who have been touched, those who have heard voices in their ears or felt unseen hands on their skin, know differently. What makes Eastern State unique is not simply that it is haunted, but why. This was not just a prison. It was an experiment in silence and solitude, an experiment that broke countless minds. The despair of those years still lingers, soaked into the stone. Generations of suffering echo within the corridors. It is not just the dead who haunt Eastern State, but the system itself, a philosophy that turned punishment into madness. Today, Eastern State stands as both ruin and museum. Tourists walk its